we are so honored to welcome for I don't know how many times, but the first time in person, Megan Giddings, the author of The Women Could Fly. You may have heard us for about a year talking about Lakewood, which was in New York Magazine's top 10 books of 2020. It was a New York Times, NPR Best Book of 2020, a finalist for 2 NAACP Image Awards, as well as the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Speculative Fiction. That's not in my notes, I just know that. So her second novel was just released and already winning raves. The Women Could Fly has been said by Lorraine Berry in the Star Tribune, and I quote, "Part of the brilliance of Giddings' novel is that the larger questions she is asking are subtle, and readers who are looking for immersion in a magical world of female autonomy will find much to love. As the sum of our discontent scorches us sear, the coolness of Lake Superior's waters and the promise that an alternative world is a boat ride away is a soothing balm. But beneath its surface, the women could fly, boils as hot as a witch's cauldron." Tonight, we will be hosting a very short reading with Ms. Giddings, and then a conversation with myself and also Ollie Schmitz, who is somewhere here. She'll show up at the right time. They'll show up at the right time. Don't worry. Let's give her a big hand. There. Thank you.
All right, now I have the microphone. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate you taking time out of your Monday night to be here. So I'm going to read only very briefly from the very beginning because I can't spoil much because it just came out last week. But one thing that you should know before I read this section is throughout the novel, there are really short stories woven throughout it. And I'm going to read one of the very short stories. And this is chapter 4. When I was a child, my mother used to tell me a story she called The Witch in the Garden of Life. Once upon a time, there was a woman a witch loved very much. For her beloved, the witch created a garden. Every tree flourished with fruit, golden berries for knowledge, ruby melons for fulfillment, onyx apples for respite, sapphire persimmons for passion. When the garden was in full bloom, the witch led her beloved out among the soft grasses and through the hedges. Most people would be able to eat only one kind of fruit, the witch said. Some two, some none. But the chosen fruit shows their heart's truest desire. Choose your life. The witch gestured at the multicolored abundance, her face glowing with the pride of knowing she alone had made all this. The lover walked around. Each fruit had its own wonderful perfume, but she couldn't choose a single one. Even the bees, the birds, the wind could choose, and the thought made her miserable. When the witch's back was turned, she went back into their cottage, shuttered all the windows, and sat in the dim firelight. It was better than making a decision, the woman felt, to see only the shape of things. When I heard this story in school, it had a different ending. The witch and the woman weren't lovers, just good friends. And choose your life, the witch said in each version. The best friend walked around. She stopped and smelled each fruit and settled on amethyst grapes. They would mean a happy marriage, a house filled with children, a comfortable life. This is how my mother ended the story the last time she told me it. After reflecting in the darkness for 3 days, the lover woke up on the 4th day filled with certainty. She rummaged through the witch's pantry, overturning jars of herbs and black as night cauldrons until she found a small sack of seeds. The woman took them outside, dug at the earth with her nails and fingers until they bled. Her fingernails cracked. She wheezed and sighed and sweated. But when the lover was done, she had planted her own row. There could be grapes. There could be flowers. There could be thorns. It didn't matter. Whatever bloomed was hers.
All right.
Okay, everybody's good?
Give us another 10 minutes.
Okay.
So welcome. What a beautiful passage. I would love, if I may, we're going to start with the inspiration for the book.
Okay. So the inspiration for the book, some of it's just this really simple thing where every time I finish a book, way back, right before Lakewood was even sold, my agent was like, well, what are you obsessed with? And it's a question that I ask my writing students, what are you obsessed with? Because usually the thing you blur out, it leads you into the direction of the thing that you want to write next. And at the time I just said witches. And I thought for a really long time that maybe I just wanted to write a straight up fantasy novel because Lakewood was so heavy, like, and it was a hard book to write. But I realized after a lot of starts and stops, I wanted to talk about gender and power. And I thought that sometimes the easiest way to do that is to take something people find familiar, which is why witches are so popular still. You take the familiar and then you try to make it new. And that kind of led me here.
Well, okay. Well, you did that.
Definitely. Hang on. Is this-
Yeah, one more.
Hello. Okay.
There you are, Allie.
Hi. Yeah, I found it so interesting that you opened with the story within a story that's really early on, and the woman being asked to choose her life. Because I think that in a lot of ways, the main character of this book is being asked to choose what life she's going to lead. And I was wondering, like, what made you decide to make Jo like where she was in her life, like at 28, in a world where women are supposed to be married by age 30, and sort of dealing with the time in her life and the things that she's dealing with. How did you place her along the timeline in this world?
So I placed her on the timeline. I'm a lifelong Midwesterner, and most of my friends, if they weren't married by 28, people would be like, well, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids? And so some of it was kind of like just a little joke. Like, if you've grown up here, you probably heard it. If you made it to 28 and you weren't married, someone's like, all right, what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely saw that in the book. I was like, oh, well, that's so weird that there's this timeline. Wait a minute. There's a lot of pressure for people to be like settled down by age 30,
Mhm.
or else there's something wrong with your life. Yeah, I found it really interesting that there was some carryover from the expectations we have now to what's codified in like the laws of the land in this version of our world.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think the other thing I think a lot is when you grow up in a place where everyone's like, well, you should get married by 25, you should be starting kids or doing these things. It sometimes makes you also feel like you turn 30 and your life is over, which is ridiculous. But I think there's a weird mix sometimes, especially for young women, where they think, what even is next? What are the new adventures? Unless they're really excited about having kids, then kids are the new adventure. But if you're not someone who's excited about having kids, I think that approach can make you feel a little lost again.
I just wanted to say that the thing about the age was I really enjoyed how it was part of a very subtle world building. Like there are lots of rules in this place. It's here. There's so much that you ground it in our reality and that you make these little twists on it. And I'm curious as to how you went about doing that, how you decided how far you were going to go. What were some of your favorite twists, that kind of thing?
What were some of my favorite twists? I think I really like the idea of being 14 and getting a pamphlet that would tell you to examine yourself for symptoms of being a witch. I think it would have been more exciting to come home for school with that than like, here, Mom, I have to have sex ed pamphlet instead. But I think most of the twists, it's hard for me to say that they're fun anymore because this is already what, the third or fourth step. I don't know how many places I've been already. But
it was fun the first time. It's not.
Well, no. One of the ways it's been approached is a few people, like the very first talk I did, someone asked me, and she was being serious, like, how long have you seen the future? And I was like, I can't see the future, but it's because there are multiple bans on women's autonomy throughout the book. And I even directly named some states that have now really escalated the way they are policing women's bodies. And so I mean, it wasn't hard. Like you can kind of guess that if a wild wild's out there, it's either Texas or Florida. So it wasn't this prescient thing. I just guessed one and it lined up. But it just is strange to write a book for years. And then right before it comes out, things that you were kind of just pushing at are suddenly even just, they're loud text now. It wasn't just me changing the rules a little bit.
I feel like you hit that though with Lakewood too, with race.
Yeah.
So you are a supernatural writer of some sort.
That's frightening though, because everything I predict is bad.
I guess that's a downside, isn't it? Yeah.
Sometimes. Oh yeah. More.
She's got 25 pages.
No,
of
it's 4. It's 4 pages of notes. But I wanted to talk a bit about the Midwest because the book is set in Michigan, mainly Upper Peninsula, and of course in Lake Superior. There was a very early quote where the main character, Jo, names what her mother designated each of the Great Lakes for. Michigan for luxury, Erie for mourning, Ontario for Canadians, Huron for daydreaming, and Superior for mystery. And I was just wondering, like, as a fellow Midwesterner, like, what, how did you come up with those, like, designations? I know it was more of a, like, comment about the character's mother, but what's your experience with the lakes and making them kind of central to the setting of the book?
I mean, I love the lakes, and I think everything I've tried to write that's longer, the lakes are always there because I really associate them. Like my family would rarely go away, but when we did, it would usually be to drive to Lake Michigan. And I always, from like a teenager, even though, I mean, being a teenager on a family trip seems like a punishment, but I always felt really creative there. And I feel like some of the birth of writing for me, it was on the shores of Lake Michigan with my family, and just no one would bug me because they were watching the water and I would get to try to write. And I think that's why they show up so much in my work. It's just, I love them. I'm really attached to them in a way that I've actually never articulated out loud before.
Well, I'm glad I got to ask then.
Groundbreaking questions. Just on a similar note, one of the things you note, and I think you've also said in interviews too, this configuration of Midwest with white, and it's white conservative too.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that. And it made me start thinking, like, what is a true Midwesterner? And I thought, well, they shop at Meijer a lot. We have Meijer.
Oh, I love Meijer. I was really upset that Indiana, where I live, didn't have Meijer. Or Minnesota has Cub, which I'm still getting my head around the idea of shopping somewhere called Cub. They
closed here.
I've never seen it before. Anyway, I don't know why I could talk so long about my
derailed you. I'm sorry.
I really did. But
I'm Midwestern and white.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's really interesting about how people approach the Midwest is how much they flair in it. I think the most radical people, like last night, actually, I had dinner with 2 of the booksellers from Source, but also their good friend Sharon, who's been a lawyer since the 60s. And Sharon is an older white woman who, she was telling about all the things that she did to stand up for civil rights, for the environment. It was like an incredible dinner. I'm still kind of reeling over all the stories Sharon could tell me about how her entire life she's been driven by anger. And I feel, but it's an anger that's made her want to make the world a better place. And beyond just her incredible stories, I kind of feel like that in some ways is a very Midwestern thing. Like, so often people talk about like Midwestern kindness, but I think that for a lot of us, like our cultural value is we want the world to be good for our neighbors. And I do think our current political state has made us less likely to see other people as neighbors as we should. But I think the most Midwestern thing that there is we want our neighbors to be treated right. We hope that our neighbors treat us right. And we care a lot about our communities. And we want our communities to be a place where people want to live. And I think that's something that transcends race. Like, I think it's really corny sometimes to say things transcend race, but it does. It's our character. It's the thing that I think it doesn't matter what your race or gender is in the Midwest. We, especially in the larger cities, we try really hard to make our places beautiful. We want to be here. And I think that's the difference, that if you're here, you stick around forever. I mean, Ellie, you were talking about how you saw your life, even though you just undergrad, but you want to stay here.
Yeah, I just moved back to Milwaukee from New York after going to college there, and I brought back another East Coaster with me who lives here in Milwaukee with me now. We'll see how that goes, but but I've been really trying to sell people on the city when I have friends from college visiting, because I'm like, look at all this stuff we have, and you don't have that many, like, you don't have to pay $4,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment over here. And we still have the public market and our rivers and our lakes and all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
But I had also found that, like, as a queer biracial Midwesterner, like, I wasn't seeing a lot of stories and characters that reflected me. Like, there are a lot, like, thank goodness, there are so many more books coming out now that have a lot of queer representation, that have a lot of representation of characters of different races. But when they are grounded in our world at all, they're always from, like, the coasts, the big ones. And I'm like, there's a third one, and we have so much fresh water. We will never run out. It's so great. Write your books here.
Never say never. Don't worry.
Oh God. Yeah, but that really, like, immediately got me hooked on the story because of how much I related to the main character Jo's, like, family dynamics and her relationship to her parents and race. There's a line that I found very funny where the character's white father listens to Wilco and the Rolling Stones, and I was like, oh, dang it, I'm gonna go see them with my dad soon. But I just found that really significant, that it was something that was taking place in the Midwest, and I really appreciate, like, that a Midwestern author has written a story set here with like, characters that are living here. But more to, like, the questions about Jo, like, I found her a really observant and practical character who can think circles around other people and kind of herself also, and has a lot of anxiety as well, that she really recognizes the flawed and oppressive world around her, but still has an inclination to engage with some parts of it, which I think is a really common conflict for people, like, trying to figure out, oh, like, I want this and this and this thing, but is that bad because the world is bad? And I wanted to ask, like, what parts of yourself you gave to Jo as a character, if you lent something to her.
And may I just say that, just because I read Lakewood too, I was curious about the connections between Lena and Jo in terms of, they definitely, they're different characters, different worlds, but there are some similarities to them. And whether you think about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the similarities because I think of them as such different people.
But the anxiety, when we were talking about anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, that's a Megan classic. Yeah, of course they have anxiety. But I mean, I think one of the big things with Jo it's like the biggest similarity beyond, like, you can list off identity characteristics that, yeah, of course, these are the same for us. But in terms of personality, I think it is that sitting in contradictions. And I really wanted to write a first person narrator who was comfortable with them, because I think a lot of the books that are out there right now, they're about even younger characters, because 28 is still pretty young, but they're about younger characters who they just can't handle the contradictions of being alive yet. Like most of the really popular first person, it seems to be an adult who's trying to learn that being an adult is complicated. And I really wanted to write a first person narrator who knows being alive is complicated, and that you, just because you don't agree with things doesn't mean that you can completely disengage. That's unfortunately a tenet of adulthood. You keep engaging, you keep showing up for yourself and for other people. And I think that's a significant difference between the two characters, and thinking about Lakewood and The Woman Could Fly, where the main character in Lakewood, if she had just engaged or talked to her mother, I mean, the book wouldn't have happened. It was all about someone who thought that they had to be in charge, and that being in charge just means taking control of everything, instead of having like honest, deep conversations about what should be going on. Well, Joe is always like, let's talk about this. Let's pull it apart. I think maybe that's the other thing, is I'm just a really vulnerable person. I wear my emotions on my sleeve pretty. Do I? Yeah, I do. But I do. I have a lot of access to my emotions. It's really intense to be around me sometimes. I feel really bad for people sometimes, because I do have a hard time putting everything away. And I know that my emotions are pretty big and can pull other people into it sometimes, even when they shouldn't be pulled into it.
Yeah, thank you.
I think just in terms of the contradictions, I one of the things I love in the book is the little touches about how the world they live in is contradictory in itself, and the way it treats witches. So on one hand, it is outlawed, and on one hand, you could be burned, but also there's a witch museum, and then there's a witch store. And how do they? I got the museum. It's historical. Maybe it's but talk a little about that witch store. It was just nuts.
I mean, it's somewhat based on like what we do now, where like you go into like an Urban Outfitters and all of a sudden here's some crystals or here's some smudge. But I've been thinking a lot about those contradictions, and I think sometimes it's also the closest thing I can think of to like the Black experience in this country, where it's both simultaneously sometimes really cool to be Black, but you're also deeply punished if you're in the wrong situation for being Black. And it's that contradiction we've accepted as a culture for a long time. And now it's kind of the root of why there's so much unrest, because it hurts to just be cool sometimes. And then you worry about your children for the rest of your life. You worry about driving. You worry that just one person's bigotry will end everything for you. And I mean that I'm going straight to the Black experience because that's the easiest touchstone for me. But I also don't think it's that much different from the queer experience at the moment in this country either. I think that if you're not in the mainstream in any way, you can find those contradictions in your life.
Yeah, I saw a lot of connections between like which bodies were policed, both in this novel and in our world, and like what things are most likely to be appropriated by other people or made into a spectacle. I think that having like a pretty big art world community of witches, of like, like this art is meaningful because these are women who are not controlled by a man in their life. And like saw that in how sometimes straight people go out to like gay bars and community spaces and they're like, oh my God, this is so fun. And we're like, we need this because there are places we will go where we will get hate crimed. Just like people engaging with various sorts of media, and found that with the witch store and also with the in the book anyway, and also with I think it holds some contradictions about like how people think about capitalism, like, oh, like this is like a sign that says resist, and you can order it from Amazon with same day shipping and have it arrive at your door by someone who was paid a horrible wage. I think that it kind of reflects a lot of what we're dealing with here in terms of like who is policed. And then even in the book at when the character is interrogated for something as a child, the center is full of Black and Latina girls, and there's this one white girl who's like basically dressed as a witch, whose deal appears to be that she is wearing the costume because that is the most interesting thing she can think of to like come up with about herself. And I think that is an issue with a lot of marginalized people's I don't know, things being taken for the aesthetic without an appreciation of how difficult it is for someone to deal with that in an authentic and meaningful way.
Honestly, Allie, I don't have much to add to that because that was beautifully said and thought out.
Thank you. I have a lot of notes.
I know, they're wonderful notes.
We're printing the notes later.
Yeah, I genuinely hope so because they're great.
Thank you.
I'd love for you to talk a little about some of the other characters in the book. You bring a lot of people to life, and I guess I was thinking about Angie.
Mhm.
You know, the friendship that she has.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little more about that, and Angie versus say. It's a tricky book because there are a few twists and I don't really want to give things away.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure.
My publisher is going to get you if you give too much away.
I know. And I'm not really sure how far you can go and say, well, that's, you know what I mean? Like sometimes, you know, like you look in if it's on the flap, the book flap, and you're like, oh, I guess I can talk about that. So I'm going to take your lead as I'm going through that.
I mean, I'm also trying to think of exactly where they said I could talk up to.
Oh,
yeah, we talked through it a little bit.
Oh.
Well, because they're excited that there's a twist. Like,
yeah. I wish I could talk about one of them, but I know
we'll all just have to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So, can I ask you a quick question before I answer your question?
Yeah.
So are you asking about Angie? Is she your favorite character?
I do like her a lot.
Yeah.
But I actually really, I mean, obviously I like the main character. I liked Preston too. You know, I think you built some rich, complicated people into the story.
Yeah. So the character that we're first talking about is Angie, and it's Joe, the main character's best friend. And they're childhood best friends, and they're also two best friends who both thought that they were the only queer girl in school and didn't realize until much later in high school, oh, we're both gay. Although Joe is bi and Angie is a lesbian and straightforward about that. And I really like the dynamic of showing how you can really bond for your entire life over both where you came from and also these identities. And also, I wanted to write a little bit about how, especially like when I was in high school, and I had not fully realized that I was bi. And I was like, why am I having all of these like intense friendships? What's going on here? And it was like, and then like later when I realized, I was like, oh, that's why those friendships were so intense.
Mhm.
So I also, it was like, I mean, all friendships are a little romantic. You can't help it. Like if you're giving someone your attention, if you're being kind and available to them, I mean, that's romance. And romance doesn't always lead to sex, but it's like one of the nicest things in the world where you can have a romance that it doesn't have to go anywhere other than like kindness and community. And so it was also really important to me to have that in the book. I'm really glad you responded to the relationship.
I do love it. And I had said that I was trying to get this book into high schools, and you're like, why? And I think that relationship, that high school relationship is is one of the reasons.
You know, one of the reasons why I said why when you told me that too, though, is I'd done some podcast interviews and people kept asking me, Like, are you afraid that your book's going to get banned? Because it's Black, it's queer, it's about women's rights. And like the first time I got asked that question, I was kind of stunned, just even considering the possibility that that could happen. And now
You're like, of course it will.
Yeah, now I'm a little, it makes me sad to think that, of course it will, but it does make me think it could happen depending on who buys the book.
Well, but it's not going to get banned everywhere. And
That's true.
So everyone just has to transfer districts, I guess.
And it'll excite the rebellious teens who will then read it on their own time.
Yeah. I think it's just upsetting that we have to talk about it so seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to what you're saying.
I was going to jump over to magic in this book. There's a little observation that Jo has pretty early on, that where she thinks that like magic hasn't disappeared, it's just the ways that people interact with and understand magic that has changed. And there are also quite a few parts where, like, without anything like explicitly magical happening, Jo's surrounded by nature and like is feeling that like a forest without any other people in it is really magical, or something in nature. And I was wondering about what you think is magic in this world today. Like, does Jo's observation hold any truth for you? Do you think that there are things that like used to be understood as magic that are not, or just what you think? Where do you see magic here?
So I think the magic of living. Well, first, it is nature. Especially again, it's that Midwestern. You see the lakes. Like when we drove into Milwaukee today from the airport, I was just stunned seeing the lake. It's so beautiful. Or just fall. It's magic. It truly is though, and people take it for granted. But just getting to see the world change and age, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. And I also I do think that there's a lot of magic in people. I know it's painfully earnest. But when I see people who go out of their way to be kind to other people because they don't need anything, they just want to be kind. I think that's the closest sometimes we get to magic, is seeing someone just give of themselves and want nothing else.
Yeah, I love that. Do you have one that you want to say?
No, I want you to
first?
do another
Okay.
one.
I'd love to talk about choice in this book. We've already circled around like body autonomy and like what choices are available in this conversation, but there are a few parts in particular where characters are having conversations about like what counts as a choice here, where like you pretty much have to be in a heterosexual marriage by age 30 if you want control over your life. But if you are like pressured by the state to enter into a relationship like that, how much of that is you? Like, how possible is it for people to be in love where there's that really obvious power dynamic? And I was wondering what your thoughts were on like the possibility of love and even power under like that kind of relationship, or just in relationships in our world and in the world of The Women Could Fly. What makes something a choice for you?
So you got to kind of one of the other big thematic roots of the book, where I really wanted to think about how you untangle love with also the things that you feel pressured to do, because our society really does pressure people to want to get married. It makes you financially more secure. It's often, especially if you know a lot of people in the arts, well, it's a way to get health insurance because you're often not married to another artist, and it's so practical. And you want to think that sometimes love is just romance. It's that deep commitment, but every time something practical comes in, it sometimes chips away at it because it gives you a reason beyond love for staying. And it makes it harder to know sometimes, am I still with this person despite the big things that are going on or things I don't like? Am I here because I want to be, or am I here because I don't want to be poor? I don't want people to say, why aren't you married? Or what went wrong with your marriage? And I always get self-conscious about answering this question because I'm married and I love being married, which shocks everybody after I answer the question like that. But it still was something I was thinking a lot about because I really didn't want to, like, I'm someone who never wanted to get married. Like, my parents used to tease me about it. Like, I would say as a teen, like, I never want to get married. I don't want this. And I ended up surprising them by being their first child to get married, actually. But it still was really hard for me. And it wasn't about commitment. It was really about all the things that come with it. Like, I still get a lot of shit for not taking my husband's last name. And also my last name is much easier. I don't know. But it is one of those things where any hint of non-conforming, or like, I don't like wearing a wedding ring, and people are like, oh, is there a special reason? And I've lost 3 already. That's a special reason. Like, I lose them. It's not some game or something. It's just practical. I've lost like $300 worth of wedding bands. I don't want to keep buying them. And I don't like wearing rings to write, but it still feels sometimes like when you agree to get married, even when you love someone, it also makes your relationship everybody else's business. And I think that's the other thing I kind of resent. It's just, I don't want my romantic relationships to be everybody else's business.
I keep thinking your husband's name might be something like John Poopy or something like that.
No, he has a really nice name. I just love being Megan Giddings.
One of the things that ties into this book is you made it almost more difficult because the person that she's thinking of connecting with, Preston, is actually a very likable character. And I was wondering how you made that decision. Like, I think in a book like this, I would have expected you to make an unlikable choice, for the person.
But I mean, that's the easy thing. And also, I get really tired sometimes of reading books where it's like, here's this feminist book, and also every single man is terrible, because I mean, that's not really how well, some people live that way. But in my experience, it's like I've had a lot of men be generous and kind and lovely to me, but it still didn't mean that the relationship was right. And I mean, I wanted to show something that is also real, where someone is great. They can be respectful, they can be funny, but you're either just not in the right place or you're just not aligned. And it's kind of the more complicated and interesting thing to me now of what does it look like when there are two people who on the surface could be a great couple, but everything just doesn't click. He's kind of my favorite character in a weird way.
Yeah, I think that also gets at how, like, the power dynamics of gender oppression really hurt everyone. Like, there are obviously people who are being targeted, and in this book it's women, but the book also doesn't leave out that, like, it's really gender nonconformity that's being punished, and like non-adherence to, like, cisgender heterosexual marriage. Like, it's mentioned that in like some states in the US, like gay men can be prosecuted for witchcraft, or like accused of witchcraft in a way similar to women, because sometimes in some states.
Yeah.
But that's also the route where there were burnings of gay men as witches too, and that was part of the research I did.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the, like, not shying away from always interacts. Obviously, like if you are someone who carries a lot of interacting identities, it seems natural that they would appear here. But a lot of the time when I see a book that is, a feminist book that maybe like all men are bad and this is happening and this is happening, and there are people of color and queer people, but the main thing is that there are women who are being hurt. And I think that your book really and the main character also is like highly aware of how like her race and like other marginalized racial categories and like gender and sexuality categories like also make someone more likely to be accused of being a witch and then more likely to be controlled or hurt. Yeah.
I think you did a great job there of summarizing what I was thinking a lot about, where I even quote this in the book, but there's this Toni Morrison quote, and I love it too. It's one of the overlaps. In Romans, I have the thing, one of the bookstores made a stencil of it, and I have it up in my office. But it's the function of freedom is to free someone else. And Toni Morrison didn't add like to free someone else who's just like you.
Yeah.
And one of the key tenets that like speaks to me about being an American even is I want freedom for other people. And I think a book that only focuses on one kind of person, it doesn't leave space for the people who we all need freedom. We need it. We need to be able, as long as we're not hurting other people or the world around us, to be free to love or to free to act autonomously, as long as we're not hurting other people. And I think one of the biggest downfalls lately of how feminism is perceived is that like the classics of the genre, they focused on one kind of person. And I mean, at the time, and this is in retrospect, I want to say that, where they still brought everything forward. And I don't want to say that these things wouldn't have made even this conversation possible, because they would. You need different freedoms to build on top of one another so that you can keep accumulating for everybody else. It's just the way our society works. But it also felt really disingenuous of me to want to write a book that is about, it is just about a woman wanting to be treated lovely as a person, to not bring in many other kind of people. Yeah.
Yeah. It's good to hear that you think that some of the questions are like carrying across what you were thinking in the book. Because that's how you know, like it's, if I'm picking up on it, it's communicated really well, if that is like what you were thinking. And yeah, I just think that the whole book is really well done. And I really hope that everyone here reads it. I don't know.
And buys two.
Yeah, one for a friend.
Please support Boswell.
Wherever you buy it from. I think maybe it's the time that we might ask some questions. If the audience has questions, we're going to, because we're recording, we're going to repeat it. So let me know what kind of, does anyone have any questions? Or we've got more, I assure you.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, in terms of your writing process, were there any differences between writing your first book and this book?
So Yulitsa just asked me, I know there's some but Yulitsa just asked me if there's any differences in my writing process between writing my first book and my second book. And one was confidence, where I knew it's the strangest thing where like, it is really hard to write a novel, even if you've done it before. But one of the differences was it took me 5 years to write Lakewood. And the entire time I was like, I'm never going to finish this novel. And I really beat myself up over it and was really hard on myself. And it was just not a fun process for me. It made me actually really disconnected from writing in some ways to keep being so hard on myself for 5 years of my life. And one of the differences is that I came into writing this book with a lot more confidence, because I mean, there's that simple thing of, I know I can write a novel. It might take 5 years again, it might take 10, but I know I can do it. And that changed. And the other thing is I made a big promise to myself that I would have fun while I was writing. I would push myself not to think that it always has to be the struggle. If it was a struggle, well, I'll go to therapy and talk it out and not just keep being mean to myself this time. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book, I wrote it so much, like I wrote it in 3 years instead of 5. And also, I just feel a lot lighter this time talking about it than I did about Lakewood. I had a really hard time doing events because I'd been in like a really bad place through a lot of the writing of it.
You're a teacher, and I'm wondering how the experience of teaching writing has impacted your own creative process.
Yeah.
How favored being one
I'm going to repeat your question, so it's on, but the question is, and correct me if I mess it up when I repeat it, is how writing, teaching writing, because I'm a professor, has impacted my own relationship to writing. And I think one of the things, it did lead me to caring more about my mental health, because I would go in the classroom and I would see my students, they're even harder on themselves than I was, where if they thought they were being unoriginal, no one's original immediately, but they would immediately say, well, this is unoriginal, I'm not going to stop writing. Even though I could point to them like exactly what was good and promising and wonderful. And I started to have a relationship with myself where I was like, well, why can't I do this for myself? If I can do this for a 19-year-old and their story is about barfing after a frat party, I can still see like the beauty and wonder in the description of the trees while their main character is having a terrible time. Well, why can't I have that grace for myself? And then it made me think a lot too about community and what I can do as a writer. So I ended up thinking it was a really enriching thing. And I especially love teaching undergrads because you can play a little more with them. You can get them to think, okay, you might think that every person is the most original, but the original thing is you. You give them the building blocks to trust themselves. So it's both like this beautiful thing that even if they're not going to be maybe a New York Times bestseller, you've given them some access to themselves maybe of what you're doing is important. Thanks for the question. I love talking about teaching. Hi. How do I sum up that question? Because it's such a good question. Do I ever look at my work and say, damn, I did that. I surpassed what I was planning. And the answer is usually no. I'm really hard on myself. But I have the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, but on Friday, like for the first time, I did a reading from my first book. I went to a book club and I read the first pages and I was like, this is pretty good. And I did it. Like you kind of have to empty yourself completely. I'm guessing you're a writer based on your question, but you have to empty yourself pretty hard to write the next book. So I finally had the distance away from myself to not be hard. And I was like, these are some pretty good lines. I was like, you did it, Megan. I'm proud of you. Thank you for asking a question.
Any others?
Yeah. So I'm working on 2 things. And one might be my next novel. I started it, but I'm always kind of tentative about whether or not it's the next novel, because sometimes what feels like a novel, you kind of cut it down. And then the other thing, it might be a novella, it could be a novel, or it could be a short story that I need to get under control. But both are kind of going at a pretty steady clip. Although now that I've said that, I probably won't write a thing in them for another month. But no, I mean, that's just the way it works. Like anytime you say like, oh, it's going well, then yeah, and then you curse yourself a little bit. I should have just said they're going. Hi. So the question was, you said earlier that you were obsessed with witches, and then what started that obsession for you? I think I actually did that verbatim. But I think some of it is that I've like big imaginative things. It's one of the ways that I became a reader, is that first I started with comic books and anything that had a place that could be an adventure or some sort of thing that was elsewhere. I would read it, and then slowly I started just reading everything. And I think some of witchcraft too, it's both when you find that really good thing, if you're an imaginative writer, where it both gives you the room to play and make something new. Well, at the same time, you can do thematic work. So witches, when you're writing about them often, yeah, that's gender, but it's also about power. And how you can attain power, not from a traditional route of, I know somebody, I have money, or I have some sort of connections or something else. And it's often the power of witchcraft, it's through education. You have both this talent, but no one can stop you if you have enough grimoires or you have enough access to learning or a community. And so it was really interesting to me to think, once I realized, it took me a long time to get to like that idea that I wasn't just talking about gender, but another way to think about power. And I wanted to think a lot about why witches are so timeless. And I think it is that mixture of gender and power that speaks to people. But yeah, in general, I think for writing, when you can find something that lets you have the play and room that you want, and also be thematically interesting, it becomes an obsession because it gives you the room to do both things that make you like writing. Hi. So the question's about my writing process and specifically about how I schedule writing time. And it really varies on the week and what's going on during the academic semester, where sometimes I'm lucky if I get to write for 2 hours. And it was especially bad during pandemic. In some ways, it was the best for my teaching, where I would have about 90 students, but we were all on Zoom. And one thing I learned pretty quickly is that students will actually come to office hours if they're on Zoom. Because I want to make them turn their camera on. I would just let them talk to me sometimes. And it's a lot easier to say what's going on if they don't have to look in or be in a small office with you. But it added a lot to my schedule in a way like I didn't anticipate. So a lot of time I have to schedule, and even still during the academic year, if I'm writing and in something, I'll work about 50 to 60 hours a week just between my teaching load and trying to write. Like I'm lucky in the sense that I don't have kids. And I think if I added kids and put that into work, it would probably be like an 80-hour work week if I was trying to do every single thing and also live. Oh my God. But during the summer, I write much more often, where I'll take breaks, but I usually can kind of binge on writing. If I'm not traveling to teach or releasing a book, I'll write sometimes like 20 hours a week in the summer. It is often not good writing. I sometimes think that the like 2 to 5 hour bursts in the semester, I do far better writing than I do when I have unlimited writing time. But I think it's also because I feel more pressure. I feel like the time has to be more valuable.
This is going to be our last question. If we get one.
I have
one for the last one.
The last question.
Allie, you want the last one?
Yeah. My last question is, do you have a couple of things that you read recently that you really enjoyed that you'd want to tell people about?
Yeah, I always do. So one is coming out in it's either late September, early October. It's called Jackal. And it's a debut story. It's a debut book by Erin Adams. And it's a horror novel. And it's another young Black woman in the Midwest. And she grew up in a town where young Black women have disappeared, and she comes back for an event, and she might try to solve the mystery or at least get sucked into it. I'm trying to make you all want to buy it.
Oh yeah.
And then coming out in January, it's by Marissa Crane, and it's called I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself. And it's another debut, and it's a fractured narrative, and it's dystopian. And it takes place in a world where if you've committed some sort of crime, you get an additional shadow. So everyone knows that you've somehow committed a crime or done something wrong. And the main character has two shadows. And their kid also has two shadows because the main character's partner died in childbirth, and the society has decided that the kid is guilty of that. So it's also really funny. I did the bummer parts of it, but it's also about like how to process grief and how to live in a world where you can't ever hide what people might hold against you or what your guilt or shame is.
Thank you for the recommendations.
And thank you for coming. And thank you for signing everybody's books at the front of the store afterwards. We have books available at the front desk. We have both The Woman Could Fly and Lakewood for purchase. Thank you, Ollie, for a wonderful debut conversation and many more. And thank you all for coming, because we wouldn't have a bookstore without you. I hope to see you at another event.